A Long Walk to Water, Chapter 15. The Story So Far. Whoosh! Water finally shoots out of the borehole in Naya's village, but it's brown and heavy looking. Having lived in refugee camps for 11 years now, 22-year-old Selva is ecstatic when he finds he has been chosen to go to America. Southern Sudan, 2009. Even though the water spraying out of the borehole was brown and muddy, some of the little boys wanted a drink right away, but their mothers held them back. The men kept on working with the drill. Their leader talked to Naya's uncle and father and some of the other village men. Later, Naya's brother Depp explained things to her. "Don't worry," he said. "The water is muddy because it is still mixed with the old water that they were using from the pond. They have to drill further down to make sure of getting deep enough into the good, clean water underground. And then they will have to put in the pipes and make a foundation with the gravel and then install the pump and pour cement around it. And the cement has to dry. It would be several more days before they could drink the water," Depp said. Naya sighed and picked up the big plastic can. Yet another walk to the pond. Nairobi, Kenya, and Rochester, New York, 1996. The Lost Boys. That was what they were being called in America. The boys who had lost their homes and families because of the war and had wandered, lost, for weeks or months at a time before reaching the refugee camps. The aid worker, a white woman, explained this to Selva and the 8 other boys he would be traveling with. The woman spoke English, which the boys could understand only a little. Sometimes she tried a word or two in Arabic, but she did not speak that language well. It was difficult trying to guess what she meant with only a word or two to hang on to, and Selva worried when he could not understand. They rode in a truck from the Afo refugee camp to a processing center in Nairobi, the capital city of Kenya. Endless forms had to be filled out. Their photos were taken. There was a medical examination. It was all a blur to Selva, for he was too excited to sleep, which made him too tired to understand everything that was happening. But there was one clear moment when Selva was given new clothes, underwear, socks, sneakers, a pair of long pants, a t-shirt, and a long-sleeve shirt to wear on top of it. And he was to wear all of these clothes at the same time. "It's winter in America," the aid worker said. "Winter?" Selva repeated. "Yes, very cold. You'll be given more clothes in New York." "More clothes?" Selva shook his head. "How can I possibly wear any more clothes?" Selva could hardly believe his eyes when he boarded the plane in Nairobi. Every person had their own seat, and they all had luggage, too. With all these people, hundreds of heavy padded chairs, and all those bags, how would the plane ever get off the ground? Somehow it did, not like a bird lifting off lightly with a quick wing flap, but with shrieks and roars from the engine as the plane lumbered down the long runway, as if it had to try as hard as it could to get into the air. Once the plane was safely aloft, Selva stared at the scene outside the small window. The world was so big, yet everything in it was so small. Huge forests and deserts became mere patches of green and brown. Cars crawled along the roads like ants in a line, and there were people down there, thousands of them, but he could not see a single one. "Would you like a drink?" Selva looked up at the woman in her neat uniform and shook his head to show that he did not understand. She smiled. "Coca-Cola? Orange juice?" Coca-Cola! Long ago, Selva's father had once brought a few bottles of Coca-Cola back from a trip to the market. Selva's first taste had been startling. All those bubbles jumping around in his mouth. What a rare treat it had been. "Coca-Cola, thank you," Selva said, and with each sip he remembered his family gathered together, passing the bottles from hand to hand, laughing at the tickly bubbles, sharing and laughing together. The journey to Selva's new home would require not one, not 2, but 3 planes altogether. The first plane flew from Nairobi to Frankfurt in a country called Germany. It landed with an alarming thump, then braked so hard that Selva was thrown forward in his seat. The strap across his stomach caught him hard. He took a second plane from Frankfurt to New York City. It too landed abruptly, but Selva was ready this time and held tightly to the armrests. In New York City, the aid worker led the boys to different gates. They would be making the final leg of the trip alone, or in groups of 2 or 3. Selva was the only one going to Rochester. The aid worker said that his new family would be waiting for him there. On the plane to Rochester, most of the passengers were men traveling on their own, but there were some women too, and a few families, mothers and fathers and children. Selva tried not to stare, but he couldn't help studying the families closely. Thoughts kept looping through his mind over and over. What if my new family isn't there? What if they have changed their minds? What if they meet me and don't like me? Selva took a deep breath. "A step at a time," he reminded himself. "Just this flight to get through for now." The plane landed at last, its wheels screeching, while Selva gripped the armrest and braced himself for what was to come. There they were, smiling and waving in the airport lobby. Selva's new family: Chris, the father, Luis, the mother, and 4 children. Selva would have siblings, just as he had before. He felt his shoulders relax just a little on seeing their eager smiles. Selva said hello and thank you many times, for these were the only words he felt sure about. He could not understand what anyone was saying, especially Luis, who spoke so quickly that at first he was not sure she was even speaking English. And yes, they did have more clothes for him: a big down jacket, a hat, a scarf, and some gloves. He put on the jacket and zipped it up. The sleeves were so bulky that he felt as if he couldn't move his arms properly. He wondered if he looked very foolish now, with his body and arms so fat and his legs so thin. But none of the family laughed at him, and he soon noticed that they were all wearing the same kind of jacket. The glass doors of the airport terminal slid open. The frigid air hit Selva's face like a slap. When he inhaled, he thought his lungs would surely freeze solid and stop working. But all around him, people were still walking and talking and moving about. Apparently, it was indeed possible to survive in such cold temperatures, and he now understood the need for the awkward, puffy jacket. Selva stood still inside the terminal doors for a few moments. Leaving the airport felt like leaving his old life forever: Sudan, his village, his family. Tears came to Selva's eyes, perhaps from the cold air blowing in through the open doors. His new family was already outside. They turned to look at him. Selva blinked away the tears and took his first step into a new life in America. A Long Walk to Water, Chapter 16, The Story So Far. Naya's brother explains that the water will not continue to be brown, but will soon be fresh and clean. After extensive arrangements and a long trip, Selva arrives in America and meets his new family. Southern Sudan, 2009. After the excitement of seeing the first spray of water from the aquifer, the villagers went back to work. Several men gathered in front of Naya's house. They had tools with them: hoes and spades and scythes. Her father went out to meet them. The men walked together to a spot beyond the second big tree and began clearing the land. Naya watched them for a few moments. Her father saw her and waved. She put the plastic can down and ran over to him. "Papa, what are you doing?" "Clearing the land here, getting ready to build." "To build what?" Naya's father smiled. "Can you guess?" Rochester, New York, 1996 to 2003. Selva had been in Rochester for nearly a month and still had not seen a single dirt road. Every road was paved, and at times the cars whizzed by so fast he was amazed that anyone on foot could cross safely. His new father, Chris, told him that dirt roads did exist out in the countryside, but there were none in Selva's new neighborhood. All the buildings had electricity. There were white people everywhere. Snow fell from the sky for hours at a time and then stayed on the ground for days. Sometimes it would start to melt during the day, but before it all disappeared, more snow would fall again. Selva's new mother, Louise, told him it would probably be April, 3 more months before the snow went away completely. The first several weeks of Selva's new life were so bewildering that he was grateful for his studies. His lessons, especially learning English, gave him something to concentrate on, a way to block out the confusion for an hour or two at a time. His new family helped too. All of them were kind to him, patiently explaining the millions of things he had to learn. It had taken 4 days for Selva to travel from the Afo refugee camp to his new home in New York. There were times when he could hardly believe he was still on the same planet. Now that Selva was learning more than a few simple words, he found the English language quite confusing, like the letters O-U-G-H, rough, tough, fought, through, bow. The same letters were pronounced so many different ways, or how a word had to be changed depending on the sentence. You said chickens when you meant the living birds that walked and squawked and laid eggs, but it was chicken with no S when it was your plate ready to be eaten. "We're having chicken for dinner." That was correct, even if you had cooked 100 chickens. Sometimes he wondered if he would ever be able to speak and read English well, but slowly, with hours of hard work over the months and years, his English improved. Selva had been in Rochester for more than 6 years now. He was going to college and had decided to study business. He had a vague idea that he would like to return to Sudan someday to help the people who lived there. Sometimes it seemed like an impossible idea. There was so much war and destruction, poverty, disease, and starvation. So many problems that had not been solved by governments or rich people or big aid organizations. What could he possibly do to help? Selva thought about this question a lot, but no answer came to him. One evening at the end of a long day of study, Selva sat down at the family computer and opened his email. He was surprised to see a message from a cousin of his, someone he barely knew. The cousin was working for a relief agency in Zimbabwe. Selva clicked open the message. His eyes read the words, but at first his brain could not comprehend them. United Nations Clinic? Your father? Stomach surgery. Selva read the words again and again, then he jumped to his feet and ran through the house to find Chris and Louise. "My father!" he shouted. "They have found my father!" After several exchanges of emails, Selva learned that the cousin had not actually seen or spoken to his father. The clinic where his father was recovering was in a remote part of southern Sudan. There was no telephone or mail service, no way of communicating with the clinic. The clinic staff kept lists of all the patients they treated. These lists were submitted to the United Nations aid agencies. Selva's cousin worked for one of the agencies, and he had seen the name of Selva's father on a list. Selva immediately began planning to travel to Sudan, but with the war still raging, it was very difficult to make the arrangements. He had to get permits, fill out dozens of forms, and organize plane flights and car transport in a region where there were no airports or roads. Selva and Chris and Luis, as well, spent hours on the phone to various agencies and offices. It took not days or weeks, but months before all the arrangements were made. And there was no way to get a message to the hospital. At times, Selva felt almost frantic at the delays and frustrations. What if my father leaves the hospital without telling anyone where he's going? What if I get there too late? I will never be able to find him again. At last, all the forms were filled out and all the paperwork was in order. Selva took a jet to New York City, another one to Amsterdam, and a third to Kampala in Uganda. In Kampala, it took him 2 days to get through customs and immigration so he could board a smaller plane to go to Juba in southern Sudan. Then, after nearly a week of exhausting travel, he rode in a jeep on dusty dirt roads, deep into the bush. How familiar everything was, and yet how different. The unpaved roads, the scrubby bushes and trees, the huts roofed with sticks bound together. Everything in the area was just as Selva remembered it, as if he had left only yesterday. At the same time, the memories of his life in Sudan were so distant. How could memories feel so close and so far away at the same time? After many hours of jolting and bumping along the roads in the jeep, Selva entered the shanty that served as a recovery room at the makeshift hospital. A white woman stood to greet him. "Hello," he said. "I'm looking for a patient named Mawian Dut Arik. Can you tell me if he is here?" Selva held his breath, waiting for her answer.